Hello, welcome to the Reprobate Pastors Podcast. My name is Todd Leonard. I'm senior pastor at Glendale City Church of Seventh-day Adventists. In a moment, I'll be joined by Shane Kinnison, who is senior pastor at First Baptist Church of Glendale, and by Galen Gogman, who's an ordained minister with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. We're three progressive pastors talking about issues that we're facing in our context, and we hope you enjoy the conversation. But before we get into our conversation today, we did have to briefly discuss the Super Bowl. Hey, so we got to, before we go on, we do have to deal with a little bit of sports. Yes, we do, because America's wanting to hear our Super Bowl recap.
Oh, well, I'd had to have watched it to.
Oh, you didn't watch it?
Very little. Last time I chose to not watch a Super Bowl was Super Bowl III when the Jets beat the Colts and the Joe Namath, guarantee game and all. And I was outside playing football. And for that one, this one I've been so uninterested in pro football this year and all. I'm a Chiefs fan as far as that goes because I lived in Kansas City for 5 years, but I just wasn't interested in it. And considering, as a friend of mine called it, the bloodbath that it was, I'm really glad I didn't. I was doing some.
You didn't miss anything.
Work others, not a thing.
Yeah.
Well, from my perspective, the handwriting was on the wall from the very beginning. My wife has a Justice antenna that's about 100 foot long. It comes straight out the top of her head. And we talk about it all the time. And she despises Tom Brady and Deflategate and Mr. Kraft and Mr. Belichick and all of that history. And so the Super Bowl for us lasted until the Buccaneers scored their first points, which was very early.
Yeah.
And after that, we went to Netflix.
Wow.
And we went to Netflix and ate our snacks.
Well, I was going to get into a whole conversation with you about, was it because Mahomes' turf toe and the KC's offensive line was injured? Is that the reason why it wasn't a close game, or was it just Tampa Bay's defense had them figured out, and then Tom Brady's offense was clicking pretty good? I was wanting to hear some real insight from you guys, and you let me down.
From my perspective, I saw more commercials than I did football. So I can talk about commercials, but I can't talk about the game. Other than that, we can talk about Netflix series.
Oh man, I was disappointed because there just was no nudity or gyrations with the halftime show. So it didn't do anything.
We didn't even see that. I have no idea who was on.
The Weekend. And somebody on my Facebook feed said, "I've never been so anxious for the weekend to be over in my life," because
That's funny.
So that's pretty good.
Oh,
that's funny.
So,
yeah, I don't know who he is, so oh well.
I didn't. I think I'd heard of him, but I didn't know any of his music, and he didn't sell me on wanting to listen to anymore. So. He had a whole bunch of dancers with, somebody described it as wearing their underwear on their head. And I don't.
You could tell it looked like a first it was a mask, and then it also kind of looked sort of hospital-ish. So I thought that maybe they were trying to make the guys, the first responders and the folks in the hospitals and stuff feel good, kind of as an ode to that and all, but. It was, kind of different.
I'm not an artist. I don't understand those things. I'm sure it was profound and deeply meaningful, and that totally went over my head. So
I did catch Gorman's poem that
I missed that
she wrote and presented. A very powerful, very, very short, succinct, but very powerful moment. I really appreciated that. And then to watch the caregiver, the healthcare worker, actually, toss the coin at the beginning, I thought that was pretty cool. But other than that, it was Netflix for us.
Well, and that brings us to our first sponsor. This podcast is brought to you by Netflix. Not interested in the Super Bowl game? Click on Netflix. There's always something to watch.
Crazy.
Get a 10% discount off your first month by typing in SHANE. We're still kind of building off of the same general area of focus from the last 2 weeks, and thinking today about just the nature of the conspiracy theory and why people are so susceptible to conspiracy theories. So Shane, this is something you've been looking into a little bit and thinking about. Start us off.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Todd. And it's good to be with you guys. I want to harken back to what you said, I think the first podcast, Todd, when you made just a humorous reference to the fact that, you know, you're 3 middle-aged white guys trying to work things out. So we don't look very diverse in our gathering. But talking about this today in relationship to conspiracy theories and the anxiety and the paranoia that kind of go with that, I think that we can speak right into that space as basically as white middle-aged guys and also as leaders of people where the organizations that we lead pretty much look like white middle-class America. And so I think we can, dive into that pretty well. I'm going to reference some notes here off of my phone, so I'll be looking down a little bit, but there was a very current survey that just came out indicating that of all of Protestant pastors that were surveyed, right at 50% of all these Protestant pastors indicated that I frequently hear members of my congregation repeating conspiracy theories that they have heard about why something is happening in our country. And these are basically predominantly white male pastors, and they're shepherding or leading congregations of 250 active members or more. And typically the membership is going to look like them, pretty much white middle-class America. So 50% of these pastors are already out there saying, I'm hearing these conspiracy ideas resonating in the pews and being shared between members and being talked about among people in the congregations. So it's important for us to have perhaps this kind of a discussion, particularly when you look at this discussion against the backdrop of scriptural encouragement and scriptural instruction, where Paul was encouraging these younger and fledgling congregations and these newer pastors to make certain that they kept to good, solid, godly teaching and didn't get off on these rabbit trails of myths and silly stories. That this is as old as Christianity itself. And even one ethicist would say in the same article I'm referencing, this is as old as the Garden of Eden, where the serpent would have tempted man and woman with some kind of a half-truth. And that half-truth was rooted in fear, anxiety, and paranoia. And so it could be as old as the garden itself. Obviously, it's as old as ancient Christianity. And so here we find it in real time where we're living in 2021.
I don't know. There's almost, I guess, a comfort in clinging to a bit of, well, craziness or insanity that I would use. Cause I mean, I look at the stuff that Q puts out and all, and admittedly, I wouldn't know where to find that. All I hear is what I've read in the demonized newspapers and things, that's come through that. So it is filtered, true with that. But I sit back and I just go, okay, now wait a minute. let's let's put on our thinking caps here, boys and girls, and let's consider what's actually being said here. You know, satanic. Okay, that's all right. Some people can get a hold of that, but all a mass of pedophilia and a cabal, and these behind the scene communications that it would take to bring all of that together. And every time that you find a hole in it, yeah, but and then somebody goes and finds another thing with
Yeah.
it. And it's um it's mind-boggling to me,
Mhm.
how just how easily folks get sucked into it. We disciples have had our we're not, thank you for calling us progressive and liberal through our time. We've got we in the Church of Christ come out of the same, non-instrumentals and stuff. Come out, we all come out of the same tree. We're all related. We're cousins. Talk about really conservative in the way you look at scripture and things. And one side says, if scripture doesn't say anything, then we're free to comment about it. If the other side says, if scripture doesn't say anything about it, we don't allow it. So you know I think there's almost something kind of back to what, touching briefly on what we were talking about last week, something that is a predisposition for folks. Um, and my wife found an article, and she forwarded it to me from Bloomberg last September, that talked about the history of this and in the United States. And the first one of these kinds of things was put out in the late 1790s. That literally it was the Illuminati, and it had, there was a cabal, and they were Satan worshipers, and they were going to lead everybody into being, Voltaire disciples and stuff, bad crazy French people and stuff. And this guy went all the way through the history of it, and named the Know Nothing Party, which we have heard about in our history classes, and went up into the John Birchers and stuff. And they've all got the same kinds of things. And now Q seems to have taken over from the John Birchers. At least that was this kind of the trajectory of this article. So it's interesting that it seems to come up whenever, as the journalist was saying, whenever one group is kind of on a wane and is kind of being phased out or phasing out, uh, that they bring up all this stuff, and then it kind of gets picked up and gets a little bit of new life of something, and then generally gets sucked up into something that becomes larger and more permanent, with less of the farther conspiracy things out there included. So it was an interesting read. There seems to be something within us, and particularly within Protestantism. And I wish I knew what I wish I knew what it was. And maybe
Well,
it's part of that authoritarianism that we were talking about last week. I really am not sure.
I'm finding it fascinating that our podcast conversations to me, are starting to really become a little interwoven. Themes and ideas applying and reapplying. Uh, we talked early on, I think Galen mentioned it originally, the idea of purity and certainty, that that people have to have certain and purity of their beliefs and their systems of beliefs and the applications of those. And the more pure your beliefs are, the more rigid you are, and the more inflexible you are. And so we push that forward to this conversation today. And again, what Galen has said, I think, can be said systemically about the whole conspiracy movement within the United States. Now, what we can do is we can take a micro scopic view of that and look at it from a religious lens, a church lens, a Christianity lens, however you want to look at it, but look at it that way and still see that within the context of the community of faith, within the context of the church, within the context of Christianity in America, there is still this push for rigidity, this push for purity, this push for certainty. One of the people quoted in the article said that conservative Christians often draw to conspiracy theories because they feel superior to their culture. They trust simplistic and binary interpretations, right, wrong, good, bad, good, evil, and they want to make sense of the inexplicable. That's exactly what we've been talking about in these last two podcasts to relative degrees, that there's a superiority of belief, a superiority of theology, and a superiority of how that theology is implicated or replicated or acted out in the culture. And so I appreciate Galen's wide overview of conspiracy theories today. And I think that as we get into a little bit more of a low-lying or lower level altitude, we can look at that as the church and see that these theories have pervaded the congregations and the churches and the households of faith. There are multitudes of reasons for that. We've already spoken about that previously, the idea of nationalizing religion, nationalizing our theology, nationalizing our belief systems. We can unpack that a little further if you want to. Also, too, just from my lifetime, as a small boy, and up until I was probably in 4th or 5th grade, perhaps, going through the training unions of my churches, where we were taught the scriptures and we were taught points of discipleship and truths of the doctrines. And then we went from that to youth choirs, and then from youth choirs to other things. And we have historically disconnected ourselves from the doctrinal teachings of our churches and congregations, our households of faith. We can talk about that as well. So is there then a biblical illiteracy that is a part of this overarching conspiracy theory movement? If we don't know what we believe, we think we believe this, but we don't really know what we believe or why we believe it or how we believe it or the tenets of it, then if there's a void or a vacuum inside of us, that void and vacuum gets filled by something. What does it get filled by? It typically gets filled by that which is unhealthy, unwholesome, and harmful. And that might perhaps be these conspiracy theories.
I think there is some great religious influence towards conspiracy thinking, and I see a version of it in evangelicalism, but I have my own history with Seventh-day Adventist end of time conspiracies. We don't call it conspiracy; we call it what the Bible teaches about the end times. And we use a lot from the book of Revelation. And the book of Revelation is just a magnificent place to put together a truly amazing, fantastical speculation about the future. And that's been going on, like Shana said, Christians have been doing that since the beginning of the faith, but we've certainly carried it on. And so in the Seventh-day Adventist version of it, there's some similarities to what evangelicals would say is a dispensationalist approach, but we don't claim to be dispensationalists. But the way we in fact try to convince other people to become part of our faith tradition is to paint a very God managed history a history that has been an ongoing fight, really, between good and evil, and God moving us along, and Satan fighting back, and using instruments of world powers and world religions to work against God's purposes, and then God raises up people to work for his purposes. And so I think you can go back and look at the people of Israel had this very strong sense at times that they were God's chosen people and the only chosen people. And that's carried on through time. And Adventists have felt like we are God's special people chosen for a particular work at the end of times. And so we've talked about how uh, nations will partner with religions to work against God, that they will teach false teachings that aren't biblical, or more accurately, aren't what Seventh day Adventists believe, in order to lead people away from God. And we will have to stand firm against when our nation and most religion all turns away from the true path. We are going to have to stand firm and stand against that. And we've been inculcated with the ideas that we must always be on the watch, always must be on the lookout for certain entities, um, different large religions, different government entities, to watch to see when they are going to take action. And that will be a sign to us that we need to get ready for the end, and that we're going to have to stand firm and maybe put our lives on the line in order to be faithful to God in this most opportune time. And so for Seventh day Adventists, we've always thought that there is some grand conspiracy of Satan at work behind the scenes. And so it's been easy for us to then latch on to different side tangents off of that main conspiracy. So I think when your faith is defined by a very conspiratorial end to the world, then it easily can become conspiratorial towards the end of your nation. Whether the end of your nation has anything to do with the end of the world or not, it's easy to see end of the nation conspiracies as well. It's easy to see how we've reacted to COVID. The churches not being able to meet indoors has been a big warning sign to many in my faith tradition that the government is against religion, and that they will try to shut down the true followers of Christ, because they literally took away our ability to worship indoors, and therefore this is part of Satan's plan to attack the church and his people. So these conspiracies have really been fed a lot this year between the COVID conspiracies and the QAnon theories.
That's very interesting that you would lay that out
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
And
Beautiful.
recognize that this is a generational issue. This is not a 2020, 2021 matter.
That's right.
No.
I could just close my eyes while you were describing that, and I could just picture all of that coming out of my own Baptist tradition and background.
Right. What was so interesting to me, as both of you talked about, is when you talk about the black and white, the good and bad, the binary way of thinking about stuff, the dualistic way of thinking about things, that is inherent in Christianity, at least as it's been passed down to us in the dominant stream of Christian faith. Now, this is not something that the mystics and some of those would hold on to, but that is that sense of good versus evil, God versus Satan, from the garden, as you were saying, Shane, and the article was talking about. That is foundational, basic to what is passed on in Christian faith generation after generation after generation after generation. And I think when you tie that in, Todd, with, and Shane, both, when you tie that in with the nations, it goes all the way back to Constantine, when the church and the nation became, united. The church lost its standing of being an outsider, and therefore any threat to the nation became a threat to the church, and any threat to the church became a threat to the nation. And when everything is so dualistic and looked at in that manner, then that made, for as you guys were talking about, that made perfect sense to me about why we can go all the way back here to I would say Constantine, and for Christian faith, because it really is one and the same, as they look together with that, as they share together with that.
That's
So
very, very interesting.
yeah.
Um, yeah, very interesting. And Galen, you made a comment that really caught me. You said that when the church and the state became one under Constantine, the church lost its place or lost its position as an outsider.
Mhm.
That really caught me, because the flip side of the same coin is the church found its position and its place at the power table. And it's been at the power table ever since, until this previous generation that we're living in.
Mm-hmm.
And the church is losing its power position at the table. And it's happening in real time in front of our faces. And the three of us would probably agree that it's a good thing that the shift is taking place.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that just fuels and compounds these conspiracy theorist points of view, because it's based in fear, anxiety, uh, 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 paralysis of some sort, paranoia of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea of losing its place as the outsider, but at the same time gaining its place at the power table, and now maybe losing its place at the power table for the first time in almost 2,000 years. Let me do a little tie-in here just briefly, and we may not even want to go down this trail, and that's fine. But I give kudos to a friend of mine who's actually an in-law family member in Florida. His name is Jim, a very sharp guy. And I shared with him our podcast, and he really appreciated it. And he responded back with a topic suggestion. And the topic suggestion actually had to do with parallels that he is seeing between what he called the satanic panic attacks in the 1980s and this QAnon and everything surrounding QAnon and the birther movement, and and Stop the Steal and all of that's happening now. He lived through those satanic panic attack periods in the early mid 80s, and the new people who were involved in those. I started thinking about that a little bit further after I shared this topic idea with you guys. And I realized, I'm not that proud to say, but I realized that I remember that there was one time that I joined together with a group of ministers, ecumenical ministers, and we went out and traipsed through the woods and the outlying areas around our little town, searching for evidence of satanic rituals and
Wow.
places where where animals would be sacrificed and the devil would be worshiped and prayed to. I actually went out one day with a group like that. I'm not really proud to tell you that, but again, I think though it lends back to what my friend and family member Jim is saying about these parallels between what was happening then and what's happening now. And I know what he's talking about because I was in that same larger environment. We had different geographies, but I was in that same larger theological environment back then when you were literally looking for a demon under every rock.
Yeah.
And I think Todd, you would be able to resonate with that, in the
Absolutely.
Adventist tradition, looking for a demon behind every bush. So whatever we want to do with that, or nothing at all, but I do want to give credit to my friend who suggested it. And I think, Galen, based on what you've said, as a student of history and patterns, I see these patterns.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so let's just see what you want to do with that right now.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that comes to mind is that, and I'm a little older than both of you guys. So I'm in the 70s when I was in junior high. It made me think when you were talking about Shane about going out and, and your dark past there and everything and looking for those things. Mine's not exactly that dark, but I have my own stuff, but we were proud in the 70s. I mean, I had a T-shirt that had I can't even get it right now and everything, but the Jesus movement, that was in the 70s, the Jesus movement, and I had a T-shirt that had the and I can't get my hand around, but this huge hand that was about this big. It said one way, and we carried our Bibles to school and things like that, and proud that it was on the outside and stuff and all. And I've never heard the time you're talking about, Shane, with all the 80s with the, what did you call it? The
Satanic Panic Attack.
The satanic panic attack. Never heard of that. But it makes sense to me, again, following these arcs of, because the 80s, that Jesus movement, instead of flashing forward and finding something new to do, I mean, it grew out what we know today of Vineyard and Calvary Chapel and stuff. They all grew out of that Jesus movement. Yes. And they had their it's interesting. They've had their life cycle with that. But I wonder if that satanic panic attack popped up in places because that Jesus movement had crested and was starting to head back down.
Could be.
And of course, it can only be because Satan is eating at the bottom of this, undercutting it out, taking people away, leading them off, giving them bad doctrine. We've got to teach doctrine and all of that stuff, that maybe would bring that arc, have that thing coming down. It's in a natural life cycle of all kinds of movements, which the church is going through now and all. But it's interesting to me that those are the two things that connected up in me. And I'll say this one last thing and then shut up. It's hard for me to do, but when you said earlier, Todd, about Adventist doctrine, you have to teach doctrine so that people will know. Shane, you made the same reference in out of Baptist stuff. Again, more conservative, more theological. And I'm ordained disciple, but I grew up in United Methodist, and I grew up in a mega church in United Methodist when the church had 7,000 members in the 60s. That's how big it was. It was one of those first kind of, it was in Texas. So it's, not that
everything's
unusual.
bigger in Texas.
Oh, it is, see right here. So
don't get that started.
But sorry. but what we've done in the church is try to indoctrinate people instead of teaching people faith. Because to indoctrinate them, now you can hold and control them. Goes back to that authority and stuff that we were talking about last week. Okay, what's authority? What is structure and organization, organism? It is alive, it is here, and we have to protect this. But God and the Spirit don't be doing that stuff. And this is the mystical role, I think, and this is the part where doctrine just doesn't fit, doesn't work. It's the part that, going back to Adam and Eve, to the earthlings or whatever, the first creatures, to go back there, that the snake / Satan, to put that in those contexts, what that does is you start chipping at that question, and instead of trusting the love that they felt, what the offering was made to was to their head. And it was, well, do you think that that's what it means? Do you think that's what it is? No, you're going to be fine. You won't die. Not as it said. And instead of trusting what God had offered to them and given to them, everything here, and this will not be the best for you, this will not be the best chosen way for you, went after the head to that doctrine to chip it away a little bit, and that becomes the entry point. People that have an ability to receive ambiguity and to be comfortable there have space for that, to be able to be around it without crumpling.
There's another part of that article where one is quoted as saying, white evangelical churches open themselves up for this tragedy of political gullibility. The tragedy of political gullibility, by concentrating only on a personal Jesus and me salvation, we spiritualized our faith, and failing to see our social obligation, we neglected to mold public virtues like respect for truth, veneration of justice, and good neighborliness. Let me say that one more time. We spiritualized our faith. And once you spiritualize your faith, then you're only a stone's throw from nationalizing your faith.
This dualism, this idea of everything being black or white, is so makes the faith so much easier for people, and so it's been so easy for the churches and religions of all stripes over the years to keep it as a good or evil. I mean, but then that just makes it when they say, all right, well, we're teaching you what our belief system is right, then it'll be very easy for you to recognize what is wrong and who is of Satan and who is of God. It becomes very simple, because if you don't, so in my context, it's people who don't believe in the Bible, people who don't worship on the correct day, people, or people who are listening to, with the satanic panic, the whole idea of the rock music being the entryway, drugs, alcohol, and rock and roll were the gateways into Satan. And so, if people were going to rock concerts and stuff, well, they're on the devil's turf. And so it's very easy to distinguish between good and evil in those situations. So when you take it on the nationalized level, it's easy for people to say what is true America and what is not true America. And for true America, it's God and church and guns and
guns, God, and country.
That's right. And
that's the order they put them in.
And any type of family dynamic that doesn't look like the family dynamic that was norm for America for the last 200 years, abortion, women's equality, all that type of stuff. All of that is tied to, and I've heard it said, these are all deceptions of Satan. And I've been told by my own church leadership since uh, the events in Ferguson, moving forward in Black Lives Matter, that all this racial justice stuff is a distraction from what God is wanting to do. And
Huh.
this is because it is not tied to the core beliefs that are supposed to matter to our church, or to good
Mm-hmm.
Bible believing Christians in general. These things are secondary, superficial. They distract from the message of the gospel, and therefore we should not be paying any attention to them. And this is just everyone wants to deny the fact of, as Galen, you said, this is an ambiguity. There's ambiguity.
Ambiguity.
Thank you. Ambiguous ambiguity, complexity. Um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, that I was told, believing in the idea of yin and yang, that's dangerous Eastern philosophy. The idea that all human beings have darkness and light within them, and so therefore, if you view that, then anybody could have something good to offer you, and anybody has the potential to harm, including you have the potential within you to cause harm.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's way too much for people to, seems like in many cases, to get their heads around the idea that as a Republican I could actually benefit from the wisdom of a Democrat, and that a
Mm-hmm.
Democrat could learn from the moral bases of conservatives, Republicans, that there's we have this darkness and light within us. No, in this dualistic way that we've handled things, and why conspiracies flourish is there is light and there is dark, and the two do not overlap. And therefore, you can tell, and then you can condemn, you can hate, you can fight against, you can do whatever you want, because that is working against the purposes of God and the purposes of our nation.
When I hear people talk about, goodness and light and all of that, um, I have fallen back into Psalm 139, where the psalmist says, darkness is as light to you. And there's another spot, and of course, I'm not one of those, tell you the chapter and verse of things. We disciples don't do that. Um, it talks about God being the darkness, God being the darkness, and in the sense of a threatening kind of experience, and that's very uncomfortable, especially if you are self-identifying as a child of the light, very Johannine, very, very, either or kind of thing there. They're children of light and children of darkness and stuff. And we are children of the light here. And then you start pulling this other stuff in there. And admittedly, for myself, I'm not a person that believes that God is pulling strings and in charge of everything, and everything works together because God is this master puppeteer and all of that stuff. But it gets really hard then when you start thinking about some of the darkness and some of the difficulties being a part of the whole.
So back to the idea then of our theology, doctrines, teachings. Uh, Another quote from the article, which Todd, I'm assuming you'll post the article on the podcast.
Absolutely.
So that everyone will have reference to it. Conspiracy theories thrive within our churches because in our teaching, we typically neglect the political social wisdom within ancient Israel's history and prophetic literature. This leaves our members ill prepared for faithful responses to developments in the public square. We have been and needlessly remain politically naive. So we are considered as politically naive and politically gullible,
Mm-hmm.
even though even though, back to what Galen had mentioned earlier, to some degree, we are in a position of political power. So how can we be in a position of political power while simultaneously being politically gullible and naive, and as far as I'm concerned, then politically ignorant? So perhaps this then is the bedrock or the basis for these conspiracy theories.
I think there's a lot there. I think there's a lot to that. And frankly, I mean, at the end of the day, the people who get a lot of that blame really come back to those of us who are in the pastoral profession.
Mhm.
We've made our livings, and I say that all three of us here have become more progressive over the years, but I think we all recognize that at times we've been we've used the dualism, we've used the simplicity, or not the simplicity, the simplistic religious
Mhm.
devices to get people to conform to the way we want them to believe, and not thinking about how that impacts the way people think about their whole worldview. And we don't realize that sometimes in an efficient way of getting what we want in the short term by teaching simplistic faith, we're actually setting people up for a lot of poor decision making and gullibility down the road. And I think we've our profession has done a lot of damage without even realizing what we were leading people into.
That's a very
Thanks, Todd,
sobering reality.
for bringing James along here to slap us on the head and careful what you say and everything. Wow. Wow.
Yeah, I hate to bring
There's
it
a
back to us.
warm place in hell for a few of us there,
So in Todd, in mentioning that, I want to make a concluding remark from the article, and I'll be done with the article. There is fear all about. Preachers can't change many minds with only a several-minute presentation on Sundays.
Mhm.
And that's bothersome when their congregants have access to 24-hour talk radio or news TV or TV news or other media, which either promote or originate conspiracies that play on people's fears. I think you're right, Todd, that as clergy ministers, pastors, shepherds, we are responsible for how we have guided or refused to guide our congregations into deeper thought and deeper understanding and deeper application of faith. And yet at the same time, on the other side of that coin, a 25-minute sermon once a week on Sundays fails in comparison to a 24-hour news cycle
Mm-hmm.
that people are watching religiously 7 days a week. So it's almost one of those darned
Yeah.
if you do, darned if you don't
Right.
things.
Right.
Yeah, it's a rowboat against a tidal wave.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now,
And when you've got people that have their own mouthpiece and all, that end up on, the radio a lot, or end up, they're constantly putting things out there. And it gets picked up, and because those folks are pulling up, not only are they pulling up the 24-hour stuff from, Q and those other things, but it's coming from my friends who I trust even more than Q. It's coming
yes.
from my friends, and I trust them. I trust Todd, and Todd's got a good head on his shoulders, and Todd wouldn't believe this if it weren't true. And look, he's posted it here. He's brought that in. And as pastors who, yeah, you're right, Shane, get, 25 minutes a week. And if you get 25 minutes a week, especially during the pandemic, it may be more like 10 or 15. then you can't combat that. Not when the brain is doing, you know, it keeps getting fed dopamine from those other things when we get all excited and stuff, and it continues to build those neural pathways and things over and over and over and over again, with all that stuff that's slamming into us through social media and things. And we're not spending but, you know, a few minutes in prayer a week or something like that, that may have a way of combating that, if it's contemplative and some kind of way of combating the negativity that that we in particular today are thriving on. We
So
just
with,
eat that stuff up. I mean, literally, a lot of that stuff is brain chemical and brain activity kinds of things that keeps drawing us back to that negative kind of crazy stuff, instead of stepping back and saying, whoa, now, wait a minute. What would my church say? And what would Jesus say in the sense of this? Not just WWJD, but in the sense of really crawling into that, because there isn't a particular text or something like that that covers this kind of experience. What do I know about Jesus that really would lead me to a place of hope and health, as opposed to the church is almost lost at that.
So what would be your one thing for each of us? Maybe we can answer this as we wrap up, is what would, with the time that we have, knowing that we only have a few minutes in a sermon and maybe a little bit of influence through our own social media accounts or other places where our voices are included, where what do we say, what type of things do we encourage people to consider when we hear more of this conspiracy talk coming out? For me, I think I want to tell people to just, again, consider, is it possible you're wrong? Is it possible that you're wrong? Is it possible that you don't have all the evidence? Um, we take stances on a lot of things just because people on our team take those stances, not because we've done independent research to figure things out. And so, is it possible that you don't have all the answers to this question and you could be wrong? Can we just keep ourselves in that place of saying, no matter what I believe, it's possible I'm wrong? So for me, that would be one thing that I would try to encourage people to try to leave open in their heads. And it's hard for all of us, but could I be wrong?
Yeah, I think for me, I would ask them in some of the in a similar way. So in this position, just to use Q and the stuff that they have put out there, in this position, what are the fruits that Scripture tells us about? You know, how does what they're doing and what they say and how you're ingesting that and now feeding that back, or, returning that back out to the world, how does that produce love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control? So, because that is scripturally the fruits of the Spirit. And if I don't see the fruits, Jesus says, you will know them by their fruits. How then can we make, how then can we step back then and see where we do find the fruits?
Both of your responses have been very powerful. The idea of, can I be wrong? Can you be wrong? And the idea of fruitfulness. as evidence. For me, I would make the contribution. I think that I would want to be one who could lead people into a further grasp, embrace of the organic development of God in the world versus the God of the catastrophe, the God of the volcano, or the God of the explosion. I think that in Jesus we began to see God as the God of organic development. That which is a seed that falls into the ground, it grows silently, quietly, until it becomes something significant, over against the booms and the the sonic blast and the volcanoes and the infernos and everything that is always shooting up around us, right?
And commanding attention.
So what where is the quiet work of God in organic development in the earth? And in the earth, meaning in people and in the globe, in the earth that God created. And helping people move away, if at all possible, move away from all of those volcanic experiences and volcanic eruptions in their news cycles and their press releases and the videos that they watch and the messages that they get from their peers and those they know and trust, like you said earlier, Galen. Where and what is the quiet work of God? I would probably try to do something along those lines.